World War I, also known as the Great War, is one of the most well-known wars to use trench warfare. It started in 1914 after the Archduke Franz Ferdinand's assassination that was orchestrated by the Black Hand that started a war across Europe. The conflict was split between two sides against each other, Germany, Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. This side was known as the Central Powers. They fought against the Allied powers, Great Britain, France, Russia, Italy, Romania, Canada, Japan and the United States. The war lasted 4 years, ending in 1918 after the Allied powers claimed victory over the Central Powers. Due to new military technologies and the carnage of trench warfare, 16 million people, that's soldiers and civilians, were killed. Before the invention of firearms and artillery, trenches were used as a defence from incoming attack, like the moat surrounding a castle. The trenches were long, narrow tunnels dug into the ground by the infantry soldiers, designed to protect them from gunfire, attacks from the air and a small amount of protection against mustard gas. They provided the soldiers cover to move around the battlefield without worry of being shot at. The soldiers were sometimes trapped inside the trenches for weeks at a time. I spoke with William Mulligan to get a better understanding of what the trenches within World War I were like.
Well, experiences in the trenches were very different depending on when one was in the trenches and where one was. So to give two quick examples, in the early weeks of the war in 1914, trench systems were very rudimentary, very simple. People were simply digging holes in the ground. But by the time we come to 1917 and 1918, trench systems are extremely well developed. There's multiple lines, there's supply lines, there's medical stations, there's concrete shelters, wooden shelters. So the trench experience really depended in part when one served in the war.
The soldiers would be in the trenches for weeks at a time, trapped in pits less than 2 metres wide. As the war went on, food became more scarce and the soldiers' rations became worse and worse. Most soldiers in the trenches would be eating meat scraps, hard rotten biscuits and bread. By the winter of 1916, there was so little flour that bread started being made from dried ground turnips. The main food in that winter became pea soup with lumps of horse meat. These harsh conditions caused many of the soldiers to get major stomach issues, which made the trench conditions feel that much worse. I then spoke to Professor Gary Sheffield to learn more about the trenches.
There's a telephone system which is actually very good. You know, the telephones go all the way to the front line, so a general back at headquarters, if he really wanted to, could actually pick up a telephone and be connected via various exchanges to speak to someone in the front line. Problem with that, of course, it's dependent on lines. So we're talking about, you know, landlines rather than mobile phones. So if you actually advanced into no man's land, got out of the trench, in other words, a telephone with you, you'd have to pay out wire behind you, and that was very vulnerable to being cut by shell fire. So that didn't really work. The next method was to use radio or wireless, as they would have called it then. And the problem was that wireless sets were very big and bulky, and they weren't man-portable. So later in the war, you did actually have some quite crude wireless sets put into armored cars, which could, you know, keep up with the front line, with the troops advancing to the front, I should say. And you had them in aeroplanes, but they're not man-portable. They're not terribly reliable either. Then you had all manner of visual signals, so, you know, semaphore codes, that sort of thing. You know, literally waving flags. But for the most part, the most reliable form of communication in the trenches and in battle was the runner, which basically means if you're an officer and you're going forward and you need to send a message back, you give either a verbal message or you write a short message and give it to someone to carry it back to the rear areas. And of course, because the chances of a runner being killed or wounded were very high, they soon learned if you wanted a message to get through, you had to give the same message to multiple people, hoping that one of them would get through.
Despite that a war was taking place, sometimes the trenches would have a surprising quiet. Soldiers at these points would have to find things to keep themselves from becoming bored and to distract themselves. The soldiers would write letters home, write in their diaries, draw sketches, read books and magazines, play card games or even gamble. It was also during these times of quiet that the soldiers could hear the hungry rats feasting on corpses. Since no man's land was laid with the irretrievable corpses of dead soldiers that the rats could freely eat without being stopped. I spoke to history teacher Jordan G about the trenches.
I mean, it entirely depends on what's going on that day. If it's a major attack, right? If we're talking about thousands of people going over the top at the same time, and the resulted firepower being unleashed by either side, then it's going to be exceptionally loud. You know, you're going to hear artillery shells landing. So the sounds of constant explosions. You're going to hear machine gun fire rattling, many different machine gun fire. You're going to have rifle fire. You're going to hear screaming, crying, yelling, music playing, maybe with a trumpet sounding or a bugle. It's going to be deafening. It's going to be like something unimaginable unless you've been in a complex conflict zone.
The trenches were clearly a difficult place to be in, especially for the soldiers in World War One. We've seen a history on the trenches, how effective they were, and a condition for the soldiers that lived there. I want to thank all my interviewees for taking the time out of their day to answer my questions. I'd also like to thank you for watching.